In administrative law, there is a clause which is named Henry VIII Clause. We will study today about this. First of all, let's see the meaning and concept. The Henry VIII Clause is form of exceptional delegated legislation under which the executive is empowered to modify, vary, amend, or even repeal provisions of an act of parliament through subordinate legislation. The clause is named after King Henry VIII, who was regarded as a symbol of executive autocracy and was associated with the exercise of extensive legislative powers. Under this form of delegation, powers normally belonging to the legislature are entrusted to the executive. Since an act of parliament is ordinarily amended or repealed by parliament itself, giving such power to the executive is considered an exceptional and controversial form of delegated legislation. Examples of Henry VIII Clause in English legislation: National Insurance Act 1911. Under the National Insurance Act 1911, the insurance commissioners were authorized to modify certain provisions of the Act. This represented an important example of delegation whereby the executive was given power to alter provisions contained in primary legislation. Factories Act 1937. The Factories Act 1937 authorized the executive to modify or extend certain provisions of the Act relating to health and safety. The provision enabled the administration to adopt the legislation to changing requirements concerning industrial health and safety. Protection of Birds Act 1957. The Protection of Birds Act 1957 granted wide powers to executive to vary provisions of the Act through orders. This also illustrates the Henry VIII type of delegated legislation. Criticism of Henry VIII Clause. Committee on Ministers' Powers. The Committee on Ministers' Powers criticized the extensive use of Henry VIII clauses because such delegation allows the executive to enter the field of legislation, which is primarily the function of parliament. The use of such powers may weaken parliamentary control and increase the possibility of excessive executive authority. However, the committee recognized that limited use of such powers could sometimes be justified because of changing social and economic conditions and the practical requirements of modern legislation. Recommendations regarding its use: limited application. The committee suggested that Henry VIII powers should be used only when necessary, particularly for bringing an act into cooperation or adapting it to circumstances arising after its enactment. Such powers should not be used as a general substitute for the normal legislative process. The power should therefore be limited in scope, purpose, and duration and should remain subject to appropriate parliamentary and judicial safeguards. Henry VIII Clause in Indian legislation states Reorganization Act 1956. Examples of provisions resembling the Henry VIII type of delegated legislation can be found in Indian legislation, including Section 120 of the States Reorganization Act 1956. Section 128 of the States Reorganization Act 1956. These provisions conferred powers enabling modifications or adaptations of statutory provisions in connection with the implementation of the legislation. Life Insurance Corporation Act 1956, Section 43 of the Life Insurance Corporation Act 1956 is also cited as an example of the Henry VIII type of delegated legislation. Such provisions demonstrate how the legislature may confer limited powers upon the executive to make necessary adaptations or modifications for giving effect to legislative arrangements. Nature. The Henry VIII Clause is considered exceptional because it permits the executive to modify provisions contained in primary legislation. Need for safeguards. Since the executive is not the primary lawmaker body, the exercise of such powers should be carefully controlled to preserve parliamentary supremacy, the rule of law, and democratic accountability. Practical necessity, despite its controversial nature, limited use of Henry VIII powers may sometimes be justified where legislation requires technical adaptation, implementation, or modification to meet changing circumstances. Conclusion. The Henry VIII Clause represents an exceptional form of delegated legislation in which the executive is empowered to modify, vary, amend, or repeal provisions of primary legislation. Although such delegation is criticized because it may permit the executive to enter the legislative field, it may be justified in limited circumstances by the practical requirements of modern government. Therefore, Henry VIII powers should be used sparingly for a clearly defined purpose and subject to appropriate parliamentary and judicial control.